Great to have you for this session. As I was whining about in the last session, not enough people care about the federal debt, and maybe there's not a lot of political incentive to care about the federal debt, but the federal debt is arguably the most significant policy issue that we face as a country. It's certainly something we spent a lot of time on at FREOPP. And if anything, it inspired me to get involved in healthcare reform, because healthcare is a big driver of the debt and deficit, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do my part to help us reform healthcare. But we've got a really fantastic group of fiscal policy experts here to talk about the debt, and I'm going to maybe throw out a question for each of them to kind of talk a little bit about their work and what they care about. And let me start with you, Kurt. So you run fiscal policy for AFP, the Americans for Prosperity, which is a major organization in this world. You spent a lot of time at AFP talking to grassroots folks out there. When you talk about this stuff, what do they say? How do you translate whatever it is people are feeling about the debt into the constituency for reform?
Thank you, Avik. Well, we do have a grassroots presence in all 50 states. We have permanent staff all over the country that are talking to people and keeping their finger on the pulse of America. And we've been really pleased to see that most Americans get it. They understand that the inflationary pressures that they've been dealing with and the higher interest costs are directly related to the federal government's excessive spending and debt accumulation. So they really do get it, and we're trying to work on solutions not only with Congress, but also with state legislatures and governors to get the spending and the debt under control so that the inflationary pressures and the interest rates can be more reasonable.
What do you think is the aspect of, what do you think gets the most traction with voters?
Oh, it's inflation. And it's not just inflation, it's the cost of living. The inflation is a more recent phenomenon, but of course, the costs of housing and healthcare and education have been far too high for far too long. And it's not just the cost, it's also the quality, it's the access, it's the personalization or the lack thereof in all of these different areas that are driving people's frustrations, because every kid is different, every kid learns different. I've got 3 kids, they're all totally different. And you need to have the educational and healthcare options that work for them. You need to have housing that works for different kinds of families. Or just based on the personalities within that. But there are so many regulations and so many subsidies that are tied to a certain way of doing things that it makes it harder to live your own version of the American dream.
Jeff Holland, you are the Vice President of Research at the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, which has been fighting this fight for a very, very long time. You've got the gray hair like me to show for it. What are you getting traction with? What do you guys? How do you feel this debate has evolved in the time that you've been at the Peterson Foundation?
Yeah, I mean, this is really our existential crisis, because it's hard to get people to focus on the debt. I mean, the whole rationale for the foundation was that Pete Peterson grew up the son of immigrants who ran a Greek diner in the middle of Nebraska. But then he, through education and hard work and some good fortune, did very well for himself. And he was concerned that future generations wouldn't have this same opportunity. So he created the foundation to raise awareness about the federal fiscal situation. So the debt is often the metric that we use. But we find it very hard to get traction. We try and point out to young people that they're the ones that will be bearing the burden of this. But people have other things on their minds as well. So it's hard to get that sort of traction. And you can see by the sort of lack of effort on addressing the federal fiscal policy situation that it has been an uphill slog. We view this as a very long-term kind of effort. But we do a number of things to try and raise that awareness, try and present solutions. Like Kurt said, we recently convened a group of 7 think tanks to come up with their solutions for addressing the fiscal situation. That's up on our website, known as the Solutions Initiative. We hold events, we give grants to various organizations to reach their specific audiences and so on. But yeah, it's an uphill battle.
And Peterson Foundation, I should mention, and I think it was in 2007, produced a documentary called IOUSA, which tried to communicate to the broader world why the debt was important and how bad it was getting. And here we are 17 years later. Actually, FREOPP is trying to produce a documentary as well on this very issue of how do we show people, kind of like An Inconvenient Truth did, that the great social challenge of their time is the debt.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. We've had various methods of outreach. That IOUSA was not really a bestseller. So maybe you'll have more success with this
We'll try.
through the medium of film.
We'll try. And David McGarry at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance, tell us about how you guys are, tell us about your work and how you guys are finding the response or the traction, where you're getting traction on this issue.
Yeah, thank you. So TPA works on a whole wide range of consumer and regulatory and economic issues. And from that perspective, I like to think about the debt not just as a number or a marker, but what does it mean? Why do we have this kind of why are we accumulating such a burden? And what that comes down to is that we have a government that is interfering in the lives of everyday Americans. It is doing things for Americans, which means that Americans will not do those things for themselves. And that, I think, is really concerning. You do have the costs of inflation, but also whenever you're looking at government spending or regulation, there's a whole host of other opportunity costs, right? A dollar that is subsidizing some industry is a dollar that is not going to go to a productive use in some industry or in some market. And I think we all know that the primary driver of debt and deficits these days is entitlements, right? Social Security, Medicare. And I want very much for retirees and older people in this country to have a safety net and to have some kind of assurance that they will be able to live out their lives in dignity and comfort. But at the same time, I am not convinced that it is a good thing for people to rely this heavily on the federal government. I'm not convinced that it is a good thing for people I'm not convinced that it is a good thing for the government to be doing things for people, as I said, instead of having people plan to do it for themselves, plan with their communities to take care of these things, plan with their families to take care of these things.
You know, one thing that I've spent some time on is, you know, the Congressional Budget Office has this projection they put out every year of the long-term fiscal outlook, and the Budget and Economic Outlook, they put out these projections, and the projection they put out on debt to GDP ratio says over the next 25 years, the debt to GDP ratio will go from about 100% of GDP, where it is now, to something like 150% of GDP. But the problem is that actually turns out to be wildly optimistic. So right now we're at like World War II levels of debt, and so 150% seems really bad because it's way worse than World War II. But actually, if you read the fine print of the CBO's reports, their estimates are based on there being 3.6% annual GDP growth forever. They're based on being able to borrow money at 4% forever. And they're based on population growth that we're not seeing today, let alone 5 to 10 years from now. Which means that if you actually, even if you just adjust purely for GDP growth, which is the most sensitive thing in terms of the projections, you easily get to 300 or 400% debt to GDP ratios in the 2050s if the GDP growth is much lower than it is now, which is very concerning when you think about the fact that neither President Trump, as we talked about earlier, or Kamala Harris really talked about the debt. As we get to 2029, maybe as the first time frame when that at least it's theoretically possible for us to have a different conversation of the debt, given this recent election. What's the solution? It's something that's more gradual that Paul Reintrater proposed 12 years ago may not work today. So, what do we need to do at this point to get the debt under control? What do you think are the most important ideas that you think are the most plausible? Maybe start with you, Kurt.
Sure, and just to build on that a little bit, the projections that the economy will continue to grow at a constant rate don't take into account the fact of debt drag. As the debt grows as a share of the economy, it exerts a burden and it'll start to slow the economy. Given the current debt level, we're probably looking at about 0.4 of a percentage point of lost economic growth right around now. It's been a little weird coming out of the pandemic, so it's not clear yet to most people. But as that debt continues to accumulate, we'll increasingly have stagnation, and that means that the debt projections against a lower denominator will escalate even faster. We'll have stagnation, we'll probably have inflation, we could have hyperinflation and a fiscal crisis. Now, to get out of this, one of the most powerful things that Congress can do in terms of fixing the budget is to actually do a budget. I don't mean a budget resolution. I don't mean the appropriations bills. I mean one bill that empowers every congressional committee to manage its portfolio every single year. All spending, all revenue. This would include Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, but also the roughly $2 trillion a year that we have in tax expenditures, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation's definition. There's really about $1 trillion of real tax expenditures in the code. All of that needs to be looked at. And when there's value, then Congress can be like, this is something we need to protect, maybe expand on. When there's something that isn't valuable relative to other things, then they pare that back. It would give them the means and the motivation to do that. Just doing a real budget with everything in it that brings all the committees into play. I mean, of course, fiscal goals, people talk about balanced budget amendments and that sort of thing. That's part of it too. But let's just start with getting all the committees involved and doing a real budget every year.
Jeffrey, what do you think about that?
Sure. Let me speak first about the CBO projections, because I was the chief of the projections unit there for a number of years. So some of the things that go into that, first of all, they're meant to just be baseline projections. They assume the current law remains the same. So they assume, for example, that the tax cuts that are slated to expire at the end of next year will do so. They're meant to be a benchmark by which to compare changes to current policy. The long-term projections do assume some feedback effects. The 3.6% is a nominal rate. So they're only assuming 1.8% real growth or less going forward. They recognize that there's a drag on debt too. They assume that interest rates will creep up over that period because of what Kurt was just talking about. They have sort of, as a rule of thumb, for every percentage point increase in the debt to GDP ratio, they assume the interest rates will go up 2 to 3 basis points. So, which are for people who don't know the term, a basis point is 1/100th of a percent. So 2 to 3 basis points means 0.02 or 0.03%. Right. But if the debt goes up, if debt to GDP goes up, say 20%, then you're talking about a 0.5 percentage point in interest rates or so on. So those things do add up. So they're kind of in there. It's impossible to project a recession looking forward 30 years. So of course they don't do that, but they're trying to project sort of average growth. So that said, their projections are a little bit daunting, going, within the next couple of years, we'll have debt to GDP ratio higher than we've seen in the post-World War II period. Our debt service burden is probably going to exceed its maximum relative to GDP, the fiscal year that we're currently in. So we know that we have to do something to address it. In the Solutions Initiative, we were trying to look for areas of overlap. Like we had some left-leaning organizations, some right-leaning organizations, a centrist organization. And there were some areas they agreed on. They agreed on addressing Social Security. All of them would have sort of addressed the imbalance in the Social Security Trust Fund, for example, in somewhat different ways, but almost all of them chose at least one way that would maybe reduce benefits. In some way, raising the retirement age, adjusting the cost of living. Again, as Avik said in the previous panel, not necessarily cutting benefits, but reducing their growth. So they presented things like that. They also suggested doing something with the inflows of the Social Security Trust Fund, for example, getting rid of the taxable maximum or adjusting it in some way. So there seems to be some sort of agreement along those lines. There was also agreement in some of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions that are about to expire. For example, maybe keeping rates where they are, but dealing with tax expenditures, either trying to eliminate them completely or reduce them. And by tax expenditures, I mean like sort of preferences within the tax code, like the mortgage interest deduction, state local interest deduction, preferential rates for small businesses, things of that sort. So there were agreements there. There wasn't as much agreement on the healthcare side, though, and we can get into that later. But that's that's the fastest area of the growing area of the budget, and probably the hardest one to address.
I fear that the biggest problem we have is that, excuse me, is that as you said, Avik, no one's really taking this seriously. I think any solution is going to require a large amount of compromise, not just by Democrats and Republicans compromising on their respective policy priorities, but also some compromise with. I think we're going to have to we're going to have to understand that the first solution or the first step towards a solution will not be perfect, and that a very serious conversation, if nothing else, to get more politicians and more people in the media and more of just the ordinary American voters thinking about these issues, voting on these issues. I think we have to have a change in mindset before the actual policy change will manifest.
We have this interesting idea from the Trump administration for a Department of Government Efficiency. Is Doge a gimmick, or could Doge actually accomplish something?
Well, I think it's way too soon to tell. I mean, this thing hasn't been staffed up yet, so we don't know who's going to be working on that, where they're going to be getting their ideas. One of the risks in that, however, is that they will come up with a whole lot of different ideas for providing government savings, which is great. But there's been also this effort to make the case for presidential impoundments, which is a unilateral presidential cancellation of budgetary resources that Congress has appropriated. Why is this controversial? Well, Nixon went gangbusters on this, and that's what led to Congress passing the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act in 1974 to severely restrict that. Might have gone too far. But my concern is that if the Doge becomes a vehicle for making impoundments great again, then it could lead to a constitutional clash in the way that we saw in the 1970s and make it harder to do the really positive work that this administration and the next Congress might be able to do otherwise.
There is an argument, which the Supreme Court in the 70s didn't agree with, but there's an argument that the Impoundment Act is a violation of the separation of powers because the president, as the leader of the executive branch, should have the authority to not spend the money.
And that is exactly the argument that some folks that are affiliated with the Center for Renewing America have made. I've read all their materials on that. But I think what is underappreciated in those arguments is that one of the chief duties of the president is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And that means that each of the agencies, each of the departments has been given specific tasks through statute that the president is supposed to make sure that they're carried out. You can make an argument that it's totally reasonable for the president to say, you appropriated too much given the set of missions that this agency is supposed to be carrying out. But for the president to say, I don't agree with the missions and therefore I'm defunding them, like what President Nixon tried to do and was rebuffed, to me, that is going too far in the other direction, but this has been a relatively new area that I've been digging into for obvious reasons, and so I wouldn't say that everything is like crystal clear. I'm still kind of working through it, but that's kind of where I am right now.
That's interesting because just the fact that you've made that kind of argument, which is very plausible, suggests the Supreme Court is probably not going to be inclined to take up this issue again and revisit that 1970s decision, because it's not like a Roe v. Wade type thing where a lot of people feel like it's wrongly decided and want to flip it, right? So we're probably not going to move from the Supreme Court's jurisprudence of the 70s on that.
I'm not a court watcher. I have no idea.
All right. Doge, gimmick or productive creative idea?
Well, I'll align with Kurt. It's pretty early to tell since it's not there's nothing there except an idea and Elon Musk and
Vivek.
Yeah. But yeah, I think there's an opportunity for sure to take a broad look, to take a big picture look at what the government is doing and see where there are efficiencies, not just in appropriations or the spending of them, but in regulations and certainly on the mandatory spending side. I mean, appropriations are a third or so of the budget or less. So, I mean, if they can take a look at some efficiencies and maybe provision of healthcare, for example, and maybe suggest things. Again, it sounds like they'll be non-governmental, so I don't know how much power they'll have. But, there's an opportunity to do some real thinking about that. And, we can only hope that that's what the end result of the department will be.
I mean, it sounds like they're gonna make these recommendations. It's going to be issued on July 4th, 2026, and it will be basically advice to the Office of Management and Budget and OIRA, these White House-based agencies, to then try to do something with and implement. But whether that gives enough time to the Trump administration to actually create regulations around it, that's, I think, an open question.
Yeah, or whether it gives time to Congress to act on them, because a lot of these issues will require congressional action.
And if Patrick Ruffini is right about low propensity voters being Republican, then the midterms favor the Democrats.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty around it, but, there's a germ of an idea that could be productive.
I think there's tremendous potential in the Doge. there are certainly gimmicky elements to it. The acronym for one, the artificial deadline for another. However, we're sort of testing the bull in the china shop theory, right? We are seeing if we can take two consummate outsiders, bring them in, and have them break things. And I think there could be value if it is executed in a responsible and thoughtful way. Now, one thing I will say that worries me is that there is a tendency right now within the Republican Party to want the executive branch to lead on policy. And if you think that you can make these kinds of serious reforms that this country needs without Congress, I think you're misguided. I've always disliked the phrase "the buck stops here." It doesn't. It stops on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that's a big part of why we built FREOPP in the first place, is because you need 60 votes in the Senate to accomplish meaningful reforms. You just can't do it through regulation for these big problems like entitlements, like a much of the other policy areas, welfare policy, et cetera. You need 60 votes, at least so long as there's a filibuster in the Senate, and maybe that goes away at some point. But it's not going away under this Senate, and so you need 60 votes. And if you need 60 votes, then you got to have a legislative approach, right? All right, why don't we open it to questions? I don't think we have a third mic, but what I'll do is I'll repeat the question after you ask it. So go ahead. So the question is, would the perhaps non-gimmicky part of Doge be that you've got these outsiders with a great platform with hundreds of millions, if not billions of followers who are going to call attention to a lot of stuff with their panache, and that's going to lead to more awareness of these problems? Could that be a way in which Doge is useful?
I'll just say, to return to my point about needing more thought, just generally speaking, throughout the country about these issues. If Elon Musk can make worrying about the debt cool, God bless.
I mean, nobody has ever won a bet underestimating Elon Musk, right?
So Ramaswamy and Musk have obviously never served in government, but that might be okay because they'll hire people, presumably, that are familiar with the nuts and bolts of government, who can do the research, and they can be the charismatic sellers of whatever the ideas are. I don't want to poo-poo the Doge entirely. I think there is some promise to it, also some peril. But you're absolutely right that there is power in the bully pulpit. I mean, presumably if Musk and Ramaswamy are on board, then President Trump will be on board. And when President Reagan came in, he campaigned on Congress should do a balanced budget amendment and all this stuff. And in 1981, his first year in office, the Senate actually passed one. And then the year after that, the House didn't pass one, but they got a vote through discharge petition, even though Democrats continued to control the House. So historically, the bully pulpit matters immensely. And so I think that if the Doge takes off and they do their work well, then it could be an inflection point, along with what we've seen with inflation and interest rates. And interest as a share of federal revenue in the last fiscal year hit the highest level in at least the last 60 years, even higher than in 1990 and 1991, which was sort of in the mix of when Congress and presidents of both parties got very serious the last time about getting things under control.
Yeah, that's a good point, Kurt, and that when interest gets to a point where interest on the debt is equal to our tax revenue, we're in real trouble. All right, let's go to Greg. So Greg's question is, he's a healthcare scholar, and his question is, how do we reduce the cost of healthcare as a way of reducing the federal debt? That's the way I'd summarize it. Maybe we can go to you for that one.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a tough question. I mean, I think, you're right. I think that the Department of the Doge is unlikely to be able to do that by itself, but to the extent that it raises some awareness, that might help. But you need to bring Congress on board. You need to legislate, especially when it comes to Medicare and Medicaid, probably even if you could get general healthcare costs down. And the levers for that are really unclear. If I go back to our solutions initiative, half of the organizations wanted to create like premium support for Medicare, give people money and let them go buy their own insurance. The other half wanted to expand the program tremendously, so you have a more centralized healthcare system. And so again, those are wildly different policy proposals. And so that it's that lack of agreement, that we need some evidence for, or could we just start small? Could we, maybe encourage site neutral payments, for example, which wouldn't really address our budget situation that much, but at least, paying equal amounts regardless of where you get treatment is one way of perhaps reducing costs on the margin. And so I think maybe a series of those sorts of smaller activities are things that the Doge or Congress itself, of course, could work on legislating and the administration could promote.
The problem with healthcare and federal budgeting is that only 12% of federal healthcare dollars go through appropriations. The vast majority of it is direct spending, and then there's also some pretty substantial tax expenditures, especially the one for employer-sponsored insurance, as you know. So how do you get that into the mix so that Congress can manage it holistically, altogether, coordinate things? I go back to the comprehensive budget idea. Appropriations are 26% of spending this year. It includes only 12% of healthcare dollars. But it all has to fit together. I mean, we had Representative Jim McGarry, Democrat from Massachusetts, talking about nutrition programs and how they're scattered across the different committees, and we need something holistic so we can manage them together. Setting aside the question of what the proper federal role should be in all these different things, as long as the federal government is going to be doing them, then they should do them well. And the legislature, Congress, is where all legislative powers are granted or vested under the Constitution. And so we need to get Congress going to manage these things. And if you're doing an annual budget every single year that has everything in it, then you can chip away at these problems, make little mini deals this year, make little mini deals next year, and just keep working at it, building those coalitions over and over again until eventually, hopefully, we get where we need to go.
Question for the three of you, and then we'll go back to the room here. We don't have Paul Ryan to kick around anymore. Who are the best? Who's your favorite Democrat and your favorite Republican in terms of being a solutions-oriented person on the deficit and the debt these days? I'll start with you, Kurt, and we can go around the horn.
Oh no.
And if the answer is nobody, that's okay.
Boy, it's actually a list. On the Republican side, Senator Mike Braun has been absolutely fantastic in putting out ideas. House Budget Chairman Jody Arrington is a rock star. Blake Moore from Utah is doing great work. Boy, I could go on and on. On the Democratic side, I hold out great hope for Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia, former governor, very effective one. Scott Peters from California, San Diego area is very invested in these conversations. Chrissy Houlihan from Pennsylvania, Ed Case from Hawaii. I could actually go on and on. The current chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, Mr. Whitehouse, has been focused not on fixing the budget this Congress during his chairmanship. He's been focused on climate activism. But when he was in the minority, when Chairman Enzi helmed the Budget Committee, Mr. Whitehouse was actually very productive on developing some of these ideas. So I think there are a lot of different members that can contribute to the conversation. But ultimately, we need to get them together. Oh, Senator Langford and Senator Hassan from Oklahoma and New Hampshire as well. I want to make sure I throw them in the mix.
Given where I work, I absolutely cannot answer that question. But I'll offer two other thoughts. There are some committees, like sort of groups of legislators within the Congress that I think offer some promise. One is the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is, again, a group of Democrats and Republicans who are kind of centrist in nature, trying to find solutions. There's another newer organization called the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, the BFFs, and they they're very focused on fiscal policies. Their problem solvers are a little more general. The BFFs are more specifically focused, and I think trying to get those sorts of coalitions together is maybe more effective than focusing on any one individual or a small set of individuals.
I don't particularly have any individuals to add, though I do think the new groupings that we're seeing are very hopeful. I would say I've appreciated Speaker Johnson's attempt to try to break up the omnibuses. At a certain point, I think as Marshall McLuhan said, right, the medium is the message sometimes. Sometimes the process that you go through is the product that you end up producing. And I certainly hope to see things return to a healthier state.
Well, Mr. Couchman's comments are a good segue into my question, because it's great if everyone's aware of it or more aware of it because of Elon and Vivek and whomever. But the people that ultimately decide are in the Congress, and a lot of them are either checked out or don't care because they're too busy worrying about getting reelected or whatever it is they worry about. So aside from a few of the stars that you mentioned that are even paying attention, number one, and coming up with ideas, number two, how do you exert enough political pressure on all of these fools to actually get them to do something?
Well, First, I'll say that I would regard very few of them as actually fools. I think most of them are very impressive individuals with talents and skills that they've developed over their pre-congressional careers. So I want to give them, props for that. But we have a systemic failure in this country. We've seen all different constellations of political power between Congress and the White House, and the problem gets worse at faster or slower rates, but it keeps getting worse. So we do need to have some of these champions to fix the system. But one thing you realize is that when you're talking to folks on the Hill is that they kind of care about deficits and debt and interest and inflation and all that. But what they really care about, other than getting reelected, is mattering as a member of Congress. A lot of them don't under the current circumstances. They are pushed aside. They're not getting a chance to shape the ultimate omnibus spending bills that get jammed through right before Christmas. The authorizing committees that they serve on don't get to participate. And I worked for Freedom Caucus members. They felt like they had absolutely no stake in the annual appropriations process. They felt like they had no opportunity to drive their priorities. They go to their congressional committee chairs and be like, hey, we want to do this. And they'd be like, oh, that's nice. Essentially. I mean, they were nicer. But so we need to actually involve everyone in the policy-making process and have them be able to see that if they have an idea that appeals to people on both sides of the aisle, they can move it through their committee can move it on the floor, and it has a chance of becoming law. Right now, there's so many veto points. I love the House Republican leadership personnel. They're wonderful individuals. They have great staff. But any one of us only has so much capacity. And so when you make those people be the bottleneck through which all ideas have to pass, instead of empowering committees to, oh, you struck a deal in the Armed Services Committee, bring it on through within some constraints from overall budgeting limits, right? That has to be more of the norm, that the committees are empowered to drive policy, because that's where the policy making expertise is supposed to lie within our legislature. Nothing against leadership, but we need to rebalance who is doing what so we can get more members to be more productive. And over time, that will self-select for more members that are interested in being legislators rather than messengers.
That's a great point, because both Paul Ryan and Nancy Pelosi have, in a sense, perpetrated that propagated that problem. And Justin Amash, actually, who's not in Congress right now, but he's been, this is something he talks about all the time, that when you disenfranchise the backbenchers, they have no incentive to do anything other than Instagram, right? Because you've given them no stake in the policy process. I saw that up close with the healthcare, the repeal and replace healthcare effort, where, I worked with a lot of members of Congress trying to fix Paul's bill, and basically Paul had his own ideas of what to do, and it didn't matter what people like me thought, or people like in Congress who had a lot of pull thought, because they just are like, it's no point in going against the speaker. He's got a very strong view of what he wants to do, and he doesn't care what we think, and that turned out to be a mistake.
Yeah, I think I completely agree that a return to so-called regular order, although I don't know if you can call it that after all these years, would work, like where the legislation bubbles out of committees instead of running through the speaker's office or the majority leader's office. And I think this started a long time ago. It started maybe 30 years ago, probably under Gingrich, where the activities of the Congress became more centralized. But I also think that most members of Congress actually do understand the situation. I think they just don't have any political incentive to act on it. Their constituents aren't demanding it. It's not obvious to everyday people why debt matters to them. I mean, again, this is what we wrestle with. Are we better served with our philanthropy dollars trying to educate the public, or target specific committees or members of Congress? And I can't say that we've come up with a definitive answer to that. But so I think that, until really that groundswell of pressure comes up from people who are voting, then I think you have a difficult time forcing legislators to actually deal with this issue.
Andy, you have a question?
Thank you. I have a great fondness for the Government Accountability Office, because my husband, my sister, my brother-in-law all work there. And of course, they're an arm of Congress. And I remember David Walker a number of years ago trying to do very good things there. But I'm just wondering, is there, but along with DOGE, GAO is still a small agency. It's making recommendations. It's frustrating to the people who work there because they're not always taken by Congress. But is there any reason to expand that agency? I mean, not that I'm trying to expand government, but it seems like a good place for looking at opportunities for efficiency and working with Congress.
I mean, GAO does great work. They do put out options to reduce the deficit, for example. They do audits of programs. They give ideas about how to make programs run more efficiently. So they're kind of doing it. They're, I think, the biggest of the congressional supported agencies. But again, you can't force people to look at it. CBO puts out a compendium of options every other year about how to address deficit, large and small options. Congressional Research Service supports the Congress too. They've got great support agencies. But again, you can't force people to act. They need some self-interest to do it.
If you're interested in this topic, we actually have a panel on program integrity later. I don't remember if it's today or tomorrow, which is Dan Lips, who wrote the big paper for us on this topic. He's the biggest GAO nerd I know. He reads every single report they put out. And we've talked a lot about how DOGE could just say, we're going to take every executive branch recommendation from GAO. Obviously, the congressional side is different. And just that should be like day one. Just take all the GAO stuff and pop it in. So that's definitely on the list. Grant, did you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I did have a question.
Get the mic from Tabitha here.
Okay, so it's 2023. Trump can't run again, so there's new. It's the Republican primary. Right now, Nikki Haley kind of ran with the entitlement reform side. Vivek Ramaswamy ran saying, "No, I do agree that the debt and deficit matter, but I think we can grow our way out of it." So I think that seems like the kind of two. I accept that it's a problem positions that a Republican could take. Why can't we grow our way out of it? You said CBO estimates 1.8% real growth. What would that target need to be? And then is that, a way to kind of hold Republicans accountable, being like, okay, you either have to address this through entitlement reform or you have to explain how you're going to get to 4% real GDP growth or whatever the number is. So that's kind of my 2-point question.
It would be great if we could just grow our way out of this. I think we're way too far along for that. I think something along the lines of 3% real GDP growth would probably do it. But how do you get there? We've averaged, CBO's projection is much lower than that. And say they're wrong. But you look at history and you see, so if you think about GDP growth as, say, some combination of productivity and labor force growth. So productivity, they've got it growing 1.2 or 1.5% a year. Say it was 2%. That would be a large increase. That means you need to fill the other 1% in with, say, labor force growth. Our labor force right now is growing at about 0.4% a year. And if we cut back on immigration, it will be less than that or negative. So the question is, how do you get there? And how do you sustain that? I don't think in a developed economy, I think it's very difficult, if not impossible, to sustain 3% growth over a decade or longer. So that means that you have to do something else. It doesn't have to be cut entitlement spending. There's a policy choice there about raising revenues or cutting spending, or probably some combination of the two. But I think hoping that we can just grow our way out of it, even with these sort of incremental increases, where I find it very unlikely we could get to 3% over a sustained period of time.
We got a question on this side. Yeah, good question. How do we build the groundswell for the debt? Well, if I knew, first of all, I'd be out of a job, I guess, because we would have done it. But I mean, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to make the connection between our fiscal situation and individuals. We've seen some of it with the recent growth of inflation and the high prices. Interest rates are another way that the debt sort of manifests itself to things that affect people's everyday life, their ability to borrow, to buy a car, or buy a house, or whatever. But it's really difficult. And the question is, do you target voters or do you target legislators to help they do the right thing? I wish I had an easy answer for you. It's very difficult. And what we're trying to do is educate people enough that the deciding factor isn't some fiscal crisis like Kurt mentioned before, where all of a sudden markets decide they don't want to lend to the federal government at rates that we think are reasonable. And then our interest costs balloon even more than they already have. So that's what we're trying to avoid, at least some sort of glide path back down. Go ahead, you have a question in front.
Thank you. So we can all look at our debt and our fiscal trajectory and say, that's not sustainable. So what's not sustainable cannot go on forever. It won't. I think that we need to have plans prepared for something that could be a very quick situation, crisis-like, where interest rates might be 10%. So if you have something like that happen where all of a sudden we really can't afford to borrow almost anything, what types of things would you propose Congress do over the next year or two, like major changes?
That's a great question, and it's something that we're working on at FREOPP. One of my big projects personally for 2025 is what we call the break glass in case of emergency plan, which basically operates. It's the premise of the plan is Congress doesn't act until there's a bond market failure or some other situation like what you're describing, and what would be the sort of best form of austerity, because it would have to be pretty aggressive austerity that would be destructive, but much less destructive than a bond market failure, which would basically result in bank collapses all over the country and around the world. So what would that look like? What would be the basic intellectual framework of at least the way I'm approaching it is it's a bit like a private sector bankruptcy or a Latin American bankruptcy, where it may involve a partial default on the existing outstanding treasury debt, which of course is very bad, in exchange for really meaningful entitlement reform, which puts all those programs on a permanently sustainable fiscal footing, so that the bond market, even though they don't like getting the default, will feel like, okay, we've solved this problem for the future and we can have confidence in investing in treasury debt in the future. That would be my approach to it anyway.
I think that's a really important question to ask. We've been thinking about it a little bit as well. If we're not prepared, then what we're going to end up with is massive tax increases, probably a value-added tax of a significant rate, which we don't have any kind of at right now. And the other big piece of it on the spending side is I think we would end up yanking most of our forces out of the rest of the world pretty dramatically, pretty immediately. And the security vacuums that could create by doing it like that, that's scary. Like, who knows what happens in that world? It's inherently unpredictable. So if we don't have a plan, I think that's where we would end up. But in terms of how you turn the tide that fast, a debt crisis is not something that would unfold over years. This is something that would probably take days or weeks for things to get really bad, and for the bond buyers to get the confidence that they would need to be able to lend at reasonable rates, or what we consider to be reasonable rates. They would certainly need some sort of a down payment of, like, this is the deficit reduction we're doing right now, but they would also need some assurances that there won't be backsliding, that we are permanently changing things so that we will have our fiscal house in order. So I think there's an immediate set of policies that will be needed, but then there will also be a pretty robust set of institutional reforms, process reforms, to assure folks that we're going to be back on track. This is actually what happened in the States in the 1840s. Northern states capitalized a bunch of canal building, southern states capitalized banks, and then there was the Panic of 1837. Things went very bad very quickly. 8 states in the territory of Florida had defaulted by 1842, and then that's when they got limits on state-issued debt or ability to finance private sector ideas, and balanced budget amendments. And then there was another round of that in the 1870s when some of the post-Reconstruction stuff didn't work out. So we've seen this in U.S. state and local governments. We haven't had a federal crisis like this, but we probably would need some sort of a balanced budget amendment, some statutory supports in order to provide bond buyers the assurances they would need to be able to make the loans again.
David, we haven't given you the mic in a little bit. Why don't we give you the last word here?
Sure. I would just note that the crisis situation is why it is so crucial to start reform now or in the near future. Policy making usually is not it's not done well under pressure. When you're panicked, when there is some kind of deadline, we usually tend to see poorly crafted reforms enacted, and that is, to put it completely mildly, not ideal.
On that happy note, thanks everybody. Thanks for the great questions. See you at the next session.